Hello everyone and welcome to the 2-1 review video. Of course, this is the beginning of our discussion and readings on sustainability and social justice. Just a few notes up front that might look familiar, either from the first video or from the D2L modules. But just remember, this module is a little different than the first module in that you have literature in it, but a lot of nonfiction and a lot of ideas. And for this reason, a lot of your questions and your thinking I want you to do are going to probe deeper into your own beliefs as well. So I hope that you develop new commitments and deepen your old commitments as well by reading through some of these things. And of course, always look for connections to your own life, your own major, your own work in the future. Otherwise, we can and should read this piece as a modern history of environmental problems and setbacks, mainly since the 1990s, so fairly recent history. And much like Merchant, our very first reading from on Adam and Eve from Module 1, Sturgeon is interested in the narratives that create our belief systems. A little side note, he uses the word feminism early on in here. In cultural studies and things, fields related to cultural studies, this simply means he's writing from a position where he'll critique power, where he's going to say, okay, there are these groups that have power, political power, social power, economic power, and are they using it well or misusing it? Feminism was one of the first movements in the 60s and 70s to start to do that, maybe along with the civil rights movement as well. And so that key term feminism kind of still holds that meaning of critiquing power, but that doesn't mean that this is just for women or is excluding men in some way or something like this. That's not what it means at all. It just means we're critiquing power here: social power, political power, economic power, those types of things. So the opening pages offer a few possibilities, and I really like this piece in the way that he writes. He's got a lot of details and a lot of good scholarship, but the piece is very good at pulling back and giving us the big picture too. It gives us these two worlds, the utopian hope and of course the dystopia in the following pages, as you'll recall. And he just takes us through a bunch of issues. All of them will be things that are appearing later in this module, at least most of them will appear, and they should be in your mind as some of the major issues related to sustainability. Concerning the utopian, most of the things he tells us revolve around renewable and green energies and food production as well. Sustainable food production, green, agriculturally friendly, chemical-free food production, and just enough of it as well to feed the world, as well as decreased pollutants and better technology use, whether it's for agriculture, energy, or whatever it might be. And that's kind of what we're getting here. In the dystopia, he also brings up issues such as war, that we're going to turn to, if things don't go well and we don't solve our problems, we'll have to turn to riskier non-renewable forms of energy like nuclear energy. That waste will be dumped on poor communities, something that comes up in here a lot and that I talked about in the preview video. That's something that it has been happening for years and years, decades really. The world can be divided then in this dystopian world into haves and have-nots, right? The United States would probably be a have. However, the United States would be broken down into areas where there are haves and have-nots, right? And we can kind of imagine the world that way already, but certainly in this dystopia and the way that we imagine it would become worse. So climate changes can increase disasters as well as agricultural problems and food shortages and water problems as well. And if there's species extinctions, they affect the biosystem. And when the biosystem changes, as we know, it can affect humans as well, even if it's just affecting agriculture, which eventually affects humans. So if we're just looking at some highlights here, page 5, he talks about the energy and climate change, that these are major public, business, and governmental concerns, and that there is an interest in all of this growing. If you read the papers at all, here in the U.S., people generally accept climate change and that it's caused by humans, but we still have, one political party, the Conservative Party, the Republicans, right, that generally have a lot of climate change deniers. It's probably worth you knowing that in most developed countries, that is Europe, Japan, you don't see that in a major political party, that there's climate change denial. In most places in the world, whether it's a sort of a progressive party or a conservative party, everybody's on board and saying we've got to change our ways. Climate change is human caused. If you're from the United States, you live in one of the few countries, perhaps the only country, where we have a major political party that essentially denies climate change. So the news looks good in that the millennial generation, folks under 30, let's say, at least at the time I'm making this video, generally find climate change an important issue. And there's pretty much a belief across the spectrum that climate change is not a hoax and that it is a serious political issue. And so even the Republican Party in America is starting slowly to change and admit that climate change is an issue, even though they have been in denial for several decades now. So that is good, right? But you should know that about the country that you are taking this class in and likely are from. Page 6. The environmental movement in the U.S. produces a view of not just the environment, but also legitimates some forms and levels of consumerism, family values, global power. So even the environmental movement norms things that are potentially non-environmental or just naturalizes things. That's kind of what the rest of the chapter is about. Maybe this is just a big idea you want to take away, and when we're reading something, we will see that as well. So again, we're back to cultural stories that justify problems and abuses of power. Some of this is just sort of big picture stuff, and there aren't always examples offered, and sometimes he does offer examples. Page 7, there's a nice discussion of how cultural narratives since the 1990s, post-Cold War, have influenced our modern thinking. Two things that have come up that he mentions in the reading are that both technology and a modern economy, that would be basically a free market economy, are two hallmarks of success for a country. And of course, that isn't true. You don't have to be a democracy or have a market economy to be a success as a country. But those are two things that the U.S. narrative forwards and that basically developed countries forward. The effect of that has been a belief in technology, perhaps to save us from climate change, investments in nuclear power potentially around the world. If we're looking at modern economies, this kind of goes beyond what we get in the book, but I can tell you this briefly. In the 1990s, organizations such as the World Trade Federation, the International Monetary Fund, organizations that are sort of like the UN, but for developing nations, mainly their economic infrastructures, they recommended the free market economy as the way to future prosperities for these developing and underdeveloped countries. Oftentimes what that meant is that the subsistence farming that had worked so well for centuries disappeared, and rather than growing a bunch of different things that could be sold locally and eaten, they were given money, the governments were giving money, and then that would be invested in the farmers to produce a certain crop that would grow very well in that region that could then be exported across the world. One that I always think of is quinoa. I don't know if you know what quinoa is. It's a grain, and it's a bit of a protein as well. And it became all the rage just a few years back, you might remember. Sort of a replacement for rice as well, in terms of how you would actually eat it. But so you take something like quinoa, which was grown locally along with a bunch of other things, suddenly it becomes something that can be exported. It seems like there's a lot of money in it. All these rich Americans are going to want to buy it, right? But what happens instead is you grow too much quinoa, the land is devastated. If the crop doesn't work out, now they have nothing to sell to the rest of the world. They have no money. They have no other crops to replace that. They were only growing quinoa. So they devastate what was their agricultural ecology to enter the world market to sell just one thing that they can do better than all the other regions in the world. But if that crop fails, or if it doesn't catch on, or if the market prices crash, suddenly you've got an entire region who now has nothing to fall back on, agriculturally speaking, or just in terms of their food supply, right? And they have no money either because they're not functioning in the world economy. They have no good to sell. And so things like this happened a lot in the underdeveloped and developing countries. Other things that would happen is corporations would come in and take oftentimes water. Coca-Cola does this. They did it in India. They're doing it in Mexico. We'll read on Mexico in this class. And they'll take a large part of the water supply, and the town will have a water shortage and have health problems, have sanitation problems, have irrigation problems, agricultural problems, because the corporation moved in to help them modernize their economy by giving them modern jobs in a Coca-Cola plant. And so these type of things really can be traced back to the 80s, but really the 1990s. We saw a lot of these type of things happening, and they're going on still even though the tide seems to be changing a little bit there. So that's what we're talking about here. These narratives of success require technology and maybe technological jobs, which could even be a Coca-Cola plant in your neighborhood in India or Mexico, and modernizing the economy so that not everybody is a subsistence farmer or bartering or trading or something like this, but rather you have a good to put onto the world market in some way. But as I showed you with the quinoa example or many other examples that are out there, that can be a big, big problem for these countries. So that's something the book didn't get into, but it's worth you knowing. All right, so moving on to page 8 and 9. Page 8 here. If we see environmental issues as a problem, we shouldn't look at just environmental problems. We have to look at the structural, economic, or social problems as well. So what does this mean? What's an easy way to turn this into a reading strategy? And that's what this course is all about, right? Instead of just saying we have an environmental problem, we should look at how women's relationship to the environment has been framed in some way. Maybe that women are the caretakers of the environment. That in itself is a problem because other people are being excused from being environmentally responsible, right? That would be one way to look at this. The way to think of this would be to think of female politicians. They've entered the inner sanctum of power in, say, Washington, D.C. or someplace like this. But because they are a woman, their voice won't be heard. They can be labeled, as we've learned in this course oftentimes. Women can be labeled as irrational. They're not business savvy. They don't understand the real world. They don't understand that there are economic trade-offs for the environment, right? And so that their morals and values may not be valued as much. They are connected with nature, and their job in relationship to nature, understanding of nature is somewhere out there in social activism or the home or some sort of moral purity perhaps, but they don't understand the political side of the environment and the treatment of the environment enough. And so maybe they won't be taken seriously. So that could be a problem as well. And so that's what this pages 8 and 9 are asking us to do, is to look at how women have been framed in their relationship to the environment and how that affects both women and the environment, the power of both. Right. We could ask the same thing, of course, for race, on another issue that comes up. We could ask it of Native Americans as well. We could say there's not enough racial representation. There's not enough, say, African Americans in the U.S. government, right? Congress, House of Representatives, whatever it may be. And because of this, of racial problems and environmental problems, what the book calls environmental racism, continues because there's not enough people that are aware of it, or it just seems more like happenstance and coincidence, yet it is not. It is a pattern of communities of color having the environmental problems of the U.S. dumped in their backyard more often than in other places. And so looking at race can show you some very specific ways that environmental problems happen. And so then it's not only the environment that suffers, but whatever race or ethnicity we're talking about as well, right? So big picture here, power and privilege protect some, expose others, and to the problems of our modes of production and consumption, right? Where everybody's doing these, but the problems are getting dumped only in certain types of people's backyards. All right, page 10. So we could look at the global south as well. That is the southern hemisphere. So there's an overexploitation of global resources. Here, these are ones that you'll probably know about. Rainforests, right? We all know about the disappearance of the rainforests. Usually the wood is being used for lumber, but also a lot of it gets cut down to make roads for giant oil tankers that need to get through. There's all types of reasons that the rainforests are disappearing. There's been oil discovered there too. And so there's been a race for oil. And so that has created some problems in terms of policy. You have a lot of countries that want to get rich quick. In South America, because there's oil there, so they're trying to sell to the highest bidder, and they'll do anything to the environment in order to get that oil out to the highest bidder. We could think of some of the food and water issues in India and other regions. You can think of my quinoa example, and there are dozens and dozens, if not hundreds, just like it in other countries with other foods, and the water shortages that Coca-Cola creates and others create in Mexico and India and in other places. And also because these countries are developing, they don't always have a strong political system and the ability to regulate what is going on in their countries. They don't have an EPA, or if they do, they don't have enough people to go out and do the work. or the political might or the political will isn't there. And so, and sometimes often they're encouraged by northern governments or corporations to pillage the land a little bit for profit to enter the modern economy.